For 50 years, Eleanor thought her husband was her protector. But as the sun went down over the freezing Canadian Rockies, she figured out the terrifying truth.
He didn't walk off to get help.
He walked away to make sure she never came back. At 72, she was trapped in a dead car with no heat. The silence out there is heavy, suffocating, and designed to break your mind. Just a couple hours earlier, Arthur pulled over claiming the engine was overheating. It was supposed to be a romantic anniversary detour. He played the concerned husband perfectly, telling her to lock the doors. Then he took the keys, the heavy blankets, and their only satellite phone.
He promised he'd hike back to a highway junction.
She watched him walk off into the snow, trusting him completely. As the hours dragged on, the freezing cold started seeping through the floorboards. She popped open the glove box looking for a flashlight, but it was empty. A slow, icy panic started creeping in. She climbed into the back to check the trunk for the emergency flare kit. Gone. The first aid kit, the matches, the floor mats. Every single thing had been meticulously stripped out of the car. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks, but it was dead quiet. This wasn't some tragic accident. This was an execution. A grieving widower, he'd get to keep everything. The betrayal was so deep, she almost just closed her eyes and let the freezing air take her. But as she stared into those dark pines, all that sorrow hardened into pure primal rage. She refused to be his victim. So she started tearing the car apart. Her hands were freezing, but she ripped into the backseat upholstery, pulling out synthetic stuffing and shoving it into her clothes. When the last bit of daylight vanished, she forced the car door open. The wind hit her like a freight train. She knew she couldn't walk back down the road, so she stepped into the snow. I wasn't gonna walk back down that road. If Arthur was waiting out there, I'd be walking right into his trap. I remembered an old map he left out. It showed a valley just over the ridge. Every single step was pure agony. Snow was up to my knees, just dragging me down like wet cement. It was so dark under those trees, with only this pale moonlight bouncing off the ice. I had to move so incredibly slow. My heart was just hammering against my ribs. I kept grabbing onto these massive pine trees just to stay upright. I told myself, just one more step. After a few hours, your mind starts playing awful tricks on you. The wind was howling, and I swear it sounded exactly like Arthur. Like he was out there, mocking me for being weak. The cold wasn't just weather anymore. It felt alive. Like it was chewing on my fingers. I started seeing shadows moving in the trees. Hypothermia really messes with your head. My foot caught on something buried in the snow, and I went down hard. I hit the ground face first. I just laid there in the dark. My body was screaming at me to just let it end. I was right on the edge of passing out. But then I pictured Arthur, sitting in some fancy hotel room sipping a drink. Putting on a fake crying voice for the cops. That thought made me sick to my stomach, and it got me back on my feet. I wasn't running on hope anymore. I was running on pure spite. I wasn't gonna let him win. By the time the sun started coming up, I had nothing left. I somehow made it over the ridge. My legs were just moving on their own, and my vision was starting to go black. I was about to just collapse in the snow. But then I saw it. Tucked away in this rocky ravine, a massive modern house, completely hidden in the middle of nowhere. I dragged myself toward that place,
lungs burning with every single breath.
There wasn't a single footprint in the snow. Just dead silence.
I just kept my eyes locked on that front door, praying someone was inside.
I finally made it to the porch and grabbed the handle. My fingers were so numb, I could barely feel the Mal. I pulled and pulled, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked tight. I started pounding on the wood with my bare fists. I was screaming for help until my throat was raw.
But nobody answered.
The wind just swallowed my voice whole. Pure panic kicked in. I knew if I stayed on that porch, I was dead. I started stumbling around the side of the house, dragging my hands along the freezing walls. I just needed a way in. Around the back, right over a frozen creek, I saw it. A tiny utility window. For some reason, the steel shutters hadn't been pulled down over it. It was thick glass, but it was my only shot. I dropped to my knees and started digging through the snow like a madwoman. My fingers hit something hard. A heavy, jagged river rock. I grabbed it with both hands, barely able to hold the weight. I swung that rock at the glass with everything I had left. It just bounced right off. The window didn't even crack. The shock of it shot straight up my arms and I almost dropped the stone. I let out this scream. It didn't even sound like me. It was just pure, raw anger. I wasn't gonna die out there in the snow. I gripped that rock, pulled it back, and swung again. The glass finally shattered. It sounded like an explosion. I didn't even think. I just used my sleeves to clear the sharp edges. Physical exertion. Then I dragged my body through that tiny window, kicking and scraping my way inside. I tumbled headfirst into the dark and hit the concrete floor hard. I just lay there in the pitch black, gasping for air. It was freezing in there, but the wind was gone. I actually survived the night. Slowly, my eyes adjusted to the dim light. I pulled myself up off the freezing concrete floor. Every muscle screamed in protest, but being out of that wind felt like a miracle. I took my first real breath in hours. I gathered my remaining strength and pushed open the heavy door. Stepping out of the darkness, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I was standing at the edge of a massive, silent space. The sheer scale of the room was completely unexpected. The main living area was magnificent, like a heavily fortified lodge. Massive timber beams stretched across a high vaulted ceiling, and a huge stone fireplace dominated the room. All the high-end furniture was wrapped in protective plastic. It was a luxury fortress, perfectly maintained. I moved through that silent house like a ghost, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. In the kitchen, I found a massive pantry lined with rows of expensive freeze-dried food and huge jugs of filtered water. Putting the pieces together, whoever built this place planned to survive for years. I kept searching and opened the door to a spacious mudroom. Hanging neatly on the racks were rows of heavy winter gear, snowshoes, and premium thermalware. It was such a stark contrast to the thin clothes I was wearing. The clothes I was supposed to die in. Still freezing, I found a propane space heater in a closet and grabbed a lighter from the kitchen. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely ignite it. But then I heard the hiss of gas and felt that radiant heat. It was the most beautiful thing. I stripped off my frozen, shredded clothes and peeled away the crude foam insulation I'd stuffed inside them. Then I found a heavy, luxurious wool blanket in a cedar chest and wrapped it tightly around my shoulders. The thick fabric finally started thawing me out. I sat down heavily on the edge of a plastic-covered sofa, clutching a bottle of filtered water from the pantry. I drank greedily, even though my hands could barely hold it steady. The cool water felt amazing. The immediate danger of freezing to death had finally passed. As the warmth slowly came back to my body, the shock started to fade, quickly replaced by a deep, unsettling curiosity. I looked around this immaculate, multi-million-dollar bunker hidden in the middle of a deadly wilderness. The question kept gnawing at me. Whose house is this? I needed answers, so I walked slowly into the master bedroom. The large bed was perfectly made, and there was a heavy mahogany dresser against the far wall. I reached out and opened the top drawer. Inside, perfectly folded, were expensive men's wool sweaters from brands I recognized. I just stood there, frozen. My hand was still resting on the edge of that open drawer. My heart skipped a beat, and this cold dread just washed right over me. It had nothing to do with the freezing temperature outside. Those were his clothes. I knew those brands. I knew those sweaters. I slowly turned away from the dresser. I walked over to the bedside table. There was a silver picture frame sitting right there. It was perfectly centered under the soft glow of a small lamp. It was the only personal thing in that entire room. I reached out and picked it up. My hands were shaking so violently, I almost dropped it. The picture inside that frame. It was a window into a reality I couldn't even imagine. It was a picture of a family. But it wasn't mine. It was Arthur. He looked 10 years younger, deeply tanned, and he was smiling. It was a genuine, relaxed smile I hadn't seen in decades. He was standing on the front porch of this very house. And right next to him, with his arm wrapped tight around her waist, was a beautiful younger woman. In front of them was a teenage boy. He had Arthur's exact eyes and jawline. The whole room just started to spin. The betrayal I felt in that freezing car, it was nothing compared to the apocalyptic devastation that just crushed my chest. My legs completely gave out. I collapsed onto the edge of the bed. As I hit the mattress, my grip just failed. The photograph slipped right out of my numb fingers. It hit the hardwood floor with this sharp, violent crack. The glass shattered into dozens of jagged pieces. They scattered all across the polished wood. I just stared down at the broken glass. And suddenly, all the pieces of my life violently snapped into focus. This wasn't some random sanctuary I'd stumbled upon. This was Arthur's secret life, a hidden paradise built entirely on lies and stolen wealth. The missing money, the endless business treks, his sudden need to manage all our finances on his own. It all made sickening sense now. Arthur hadn't been making bad investments. He'd been siphoning our massive estate, dollar by dollar, into this off-grid fortress, all for his second family. The ultimate horrifying cruelty of his plan became terrifyingly clear. He drove me out to the wilderness to die. He knew his luxury bunker was just a few miles over the ridge. He knew exactly where to leave me so I'd freeze to death. Well, I could just hike through the woods, let himself in, and sit comfortably by the fire. I sat in the silence of that secret house for hours, surrounded by the physical evidence of his grotesque deception. I didn't move. And I didn't cry. The devoted wife, who trusted him for 50 years, died in that room. And in her place, something cold, sharp, and intensely focused was born. I wasn't going to wait for a rescue team or hike out to the police. No, I was going to use the fortress he built with my money to survive. When spring came, I'd be waiting. Surviving out there was a total war of the mind. I spent days figuring out his complex solar battery banks. I rationed every watt so the house wouldn't go dark. Keeping that place warm meant mastering the wood-burning stove.
I spent hours in the freezing shed swinging a heavy axe.
The grueling work slowly made me leaner and harder. Inside, I fed those logs into the massive stone fireplace. That fire became my only comfort against the lethal cold. With every log that burned, my plan got sharper. I carefully managed the massive stash of freeze-dried food he'd hoarded. I'd melt fresh snow over a camping stove for Wark. Every meal felt like a quiet little victory. When it got really cold, I had to wear her clothes. Zipping up that luxurious cream-colored parka made my stomach turn. But it reminded me exactly why I was surviving. My most important work was down in Arthur's basement study. I found a row of heavy metal filing cabinets locked up tight. I grabbed an iron crowbar from the shed, ready to dig. I jammed that crowbar into the seam and threw my entire weight against it. The lock finally snapped with a loud crack. It opened up an absolute masterclass in financial deception. I sat at his oak desk and pulled out thick stacks of offshore bank statements. He had ledgers documenting exactly how much he'd stolen from us. 15 years of lies, all written down. I even found fake international passports with stolen identities. Holding them, the sheer scale of his betrayal hit me. I was building a cage for him, bar by iron bar. I found the boy's birth certificate buried in the files. 14 years old? He'd been living this double life for a decade and a half. The sheer scale of the lie was just staggering. But the worst part was finding his personal journals. I sat by the fire and read his darkest thoughts. He wrote about how much he despised me, how he couldn't wait for me to die. He even wrote down the exact coordinates where he planned to abandon the car. It was premeditated murder, written in his own arrogant handwriting. I gathered every single piece of evidence. Every ledger, every bank statement, every journal. I packed them all into a heavy, waterproof bag. I wasn't some victim waiting to be rescued anymore. I was building a cage for him, bar by iron bar. As the months dragged on, winter finally started to lose its grip. The howling winds died down. The ice on the windows started to thin out. You could hear the melting snow dripping from the roof. Spring was finally coming to the Rockies. I knew my time was coming. In the armory, I found a locked case with a high-end satellite radio. It was sitting right next to a rack of hunting rifles. Arthur spared no expense when it came to his own safety. And now, I was going to use his own tools against him. I spent 2 weeks reading the technical manuals for that radio. I had to learn how to power it up and lock onto the emergency frequencies. But I didn't call for help right away. If the cops showed up too soon, Arthur would see it on the news. He'd empty the accounts and just disappear. By late May, the roads were finally clear enough to drive on. So I started prepping the house. I cleaned the kitchen, wiped down the counters, and erased any sign I was ever there. I needed the place to look exactly how he left it. I needed him to walk right into the trap. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the silence finally broke. I heard the low growl of a heavy engine coming up the valley. I was just sitting in the living room with a cup of tea. I didn't panic. I just looked toward the window, feeling completely, terrifyingly calm. Through the slits in the shutters, I watched them pull up. A heavy black SUV rolled right up the driveway. It parked right by the front porch. This was the moment I'd been waiting for agonizing months for. He had finally come back to claim his kingdom. The door opened and Arthur stepped out. He was wearing this pristine leather jacket, looking completely relaxed. He had this smug, entitled look on his face. He really thought he'd pulled off the perfect crime.
He thought he was untouchable. He walked around to the passenger side and opened the door. The younger woman from the photograph stepped out into the crisp spring air. She smiled brightly, completely oblivious to the nightmare waiting inside. Arthur pulled her close, kissing her cheek like a man without a single care in the world. He pointed out the architectural details of the bunker, boasting about the heavy steel shutters. He was showing off their new permanent home, thinking he'd pulled off the perfect crime. Inside the bunker, Eleanor watched them through the narrow slits of the steel shutters. Her eyes were as cold and hard as the brutal winter she had just survived. She didn't feel any panic, just a terrifying, absolute calm. She reached down, her hand resting on the heavy, loaded hunting rifle next to her chair. She didn't intend to shoot him. That would be way too quick. She just needed to make sure he didn't try to run. 30 seconds earlier, she had pressed the activation button on the emergency locator beacon. She was broadcasting her exact coordinates directly to the feds. She also engaged the satellite radio on an open frequency. Every single word spoken in the next 10 minutes was going to be captured as federal evidence. The heavy front door unlocked with a loud click. Arthur pushed it open, laughing at something the younger woman had said. He stepped into the mudroom and kicked off his boots. He was completely unaware that he had just walked right into his own tomb. Arthur strolled into the main living room, his hands casually tucked into his pockets. He looked toward the massive stone fireplace, expecting an empty house. He was totally relaxed, acting like a man who owned the world. Then his eyes drifted to the large leather armchair in the center of the room. Eleanor sat there, completely motionless. She was wearing his favorite heavy wool sweater. She stared back at him like a ghost who had come to collect a massive debt. On the coffee table in front of her rested the massive stack of damning evidence. The offshore bank statements, the fake passports, and his handwritten journals were all neatly arranged. It was the complete, undeniable proof of his secret life, laid bare for him to see. Arthur stopped dead in his tracks. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like a ghost. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His eyes widened in absolute paralyzing terror as his entire world crashed down around him. Arthur stumbled backward as his legs suddenly gave out beneath him. He crashed into a heavy wooden side table, sending a lamp shattering onto the hardwood floor. The reality of his absolute destruction was finally crashing down on him. Eleanor just sat there, perfectly still. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, steady, and completely empty of any emotion. She simply said, "Hello, Arthur." It was the chilling voice of a ghost who had come back to collect a massive debt. Arthur choked out her name, the words scraping against his throat like dry sandpaper. He was trembling violently, staring at her like the devil himself was sitting right there in his living room. He stammered, begging to know how she could possibly be alive. Eleanor didn't even blink. She smoothly picked up one of his handwritten journals from the table, slowly turning it over in her weathered hands. She told him that he had always underestimated her. She reminded him that he thought she was just a frail old woman who would quietly freeze to death. But he forgot one very important thing. She built him up, and now she was gonna tear him down. Right then, the younger woman walked into the living room, stopping dead in her tracks when she saw Eleanor sitting there. She looked at Arthur, her voice suddenly laced with deep confusion and fear, asking who this strange woman was. Arthur couldn't even form a sentence. He was hyperventilating, his panicked eyes darting frantically from Eleanor to the damning documents on the table. Then
His gaze locked onto the heavy hunting rifle resting casually against her chair, realizing he was completely trapped. Eleanor shifted her cold gaze directly to the younger woman.
She stated clearly that she was Arthur's wife.
She explained that this massive house, the offshore accounts, and the entire luxurious life he had promised her had all been stolen. Eleanor didn't raise her voice, but every word cut like a knife. She told the younger woman that she could keep him now. But she warned her that Arthur was about to become a very, very expensive liability. Hearing his entire life dismantled in seconds, Arthur's shock violently mutated into pure panic and rage. He suddenly lunged forward toward the coffee table.
He was absolutely desperate to grab those journals and destroy the evidence before it was too late.
Eleanor didn't even flinch. She just raised the barrel of that hunting rifle, pointing it right at his chest. Her hands were terrifyingly steady.
She whispered for him to take another step, and the ice in her voice froze him in his tracks.
Arthur threw his hands up, stumbling backward.
He was gasping for air, completely terrified.
He started begging her, saying they could talk about it, that he could explain everything.
He was desperate to make a deal and save his own skin.
But Eleanor just looked at her. She told him there were no deals anymore, only consequences.
She'd survived 4 months in -20 degrees because of this man. And she made it crystal clear she wouldn't hesitate to end him right there. Before Arthur could even get another word out, a low thumping sound echoed through the valley. It got louder and louder, literally shaking the heavy glass windows. The younger woman ran over to look outside. She covered her mouth in absolute horror. Outside, 2 massive search and rescue helicopters were dropping out of the sky. Their rotors were kicking up a massive storm of dirt and melting snow. Down the access road, you could hear the wailing sirens of law enforcement. Heavily armed officers were responding to her federal distress signal.
Inside the bunker, Arthur just collapsed.
He fell to his knees, buried his face in his hands, and let out this pathetic, broken sob. It was all over. His fortune, his freedom, and his perfect double life had just been completely annihilated. Eleanor finally stood up from the chair. She didn't even give him a second glance. She just walked right past his trembling body. Her heavy winter boots echoed loudly on the hardwood floor as she left him behind. She pushed open that heavy front door and stepped out onto the porch. She took a deep breath of the crisp, clean spring air. The nightmare was finally over. She was walking out into the light, entirely on her own terms. The helicopters touched down and tactical teams swarmed the property. They rushed right past her to secure the man inside. Paramedics hurried over, wrapping her in a thermal blanket.
They were absolutely astounded by the condition of a woman who'd been presumed dead for half a year.
Eleanor just smiled softly, looking out over the untamed mountains that had tried to kill her. She'd been betrayed and left to die in the freezing dark. But she didn't just survive the impossible, she conquered it. Would you have had the strength to survive the ultimate betrayal?
Let me know in the comments.
The wilderness doesn't care about human suffering. It's just a vast, indifferent expanse that swallows the weak. When faced with the ultimate betrayal, most would have just surrendered to the freezing dark.
But Eleanor's story asks a profound question of all of us.
Could you have had the strength to survive? Imagine being completely cut off from the world, abandoned by the one person you trusted most. The isolation alone is enough to break the human mind, let alone those lethal temperatures. She had nothing but her sheer will to keep her alive in that frozen tomb. It was a crucible that burned away her old life. We often wonder how we'd react when pushed past the absolute limit. Would we crumble? Or would we find some hidden reservoir of primal rage to keep us moving? Eleanor chose to fight back against the dying of the light. Let me know in the comments below how you think you'd handle a nightmare like this. For 50 years, Eleanor believed the man she married was her ultimate protector. She built a life, a family, and a fortune with him. She trusted him implicitly. But that trust was weaponized against her in the most cruel way imaginable. The illusion of safety was shattered the moment that car engine died. Arthur's meticulously crafted double life was built on a foundation of lies.
He really thought he'd executed the perfect crime?
Leaving no loose ends out there in the snow.
But he completely underestimated the woman he'd spent half a century with.
His arrogance became the very instrument of his absolute destruction. This luxury bunker was designed to be Arthur's secret paradise. Instead, it transformed into his personal purgatory. Every piece of damning evidence was just waiting for him. The ledgers, the fake passports, the journals, they sealed his fate. He lost his fortune, his freedom, and his mind in a matter of seconds. As the helicopters carried Arthur away to face federal justice, the silence returned. But it wasn't that suffocating, terrifying silence anymore. It was the quiet peace of a hard-won victory. The wilderness had tested her, and she had emerged as its master. The physical scars of her ordeal might fade, but the internal transformation is permanent. That frail, trusting wife died in the freezing dark of that logging road. In her place stands a hardened survivor, forged in the brutal cold of the Canadian Rockies. She's a living testament to the unbreakable nature of the human spirit. We all navigate a world where trust can be broken, where safety is sometimes just an illusion. Eleanor's journey reminds us that when the safety nets fail, we have to become our own saviors. Because sometimes the only protector you have in the wild is yourself. You gotta be willing to fight for your own life. As the spring thaw washes away the last remnants of winter, Eleanor looks toward the horizon. She's no longer a victim, no longer a ghost haunting a secret house. She is the architect of her own survival, stepping into the light with absolute authority. Her story is gonna echo through these mountains forever. When the temperature drops that low, your own body starts lying to you. It promises the pain will stop if you just go to sleep. Eleanor had to fight a brutal war against her own mind. She didn't just sit in that bunker waiting to be saved. She went to work. Every log she split, and every fire she built, stripped away the frail woman she used to be. She was forging a completely new version of herself. Finding that photograph was the final nail in the coffin of her old life. The woman who loved Arthur died right there on the hardwood floor. And the person who stood back up, she was an executioner. She knew that just surviving wouldn't be enough to stop a man like Arthur. He had the money and the resources to disappear. So she spent the winter building a trap he could never escape. Then there was the second wife. She had no idea her perfect life was bought with stolen money and a murder attempt. She walked into that house expecting a romantic getaway, but walked into a nightmare. Imagine the absolute terror of walking into your secret safe house, expecting it to be empty. Instead, the wife you left for dead is sitting right there. In that split second, Arthur realized he had lost everything. She didn't even need to pull the trigger. That rifle was just a message. It told him that she was the one in control now. He couldn't run, and he couldn't talk his way out of it. When those helicopter rotors started shaking the glass, Arthur's fate was sealed. She timed the distress call perfectly. She wanted him to know he was caught right before the feds kicked the door in.
The rescue teams couldn't believe what they were seeing.
They came looking for a tragic recovery mission.
Instead, they found a woman who had just outsmarted a millionaire and survived a deadly winter all by herself.
Eleanor's story proves you never really know what someone is capable of until the masks come off. It's a terrifying thought, but it's also a reminder that you are stronger than you think. Arthur thought he engineered the perfect crime. He believed the brutal winter would do his dirty work. But his arrogance blinded him to Eleanor's unstoppable will to live.
Investigators later marveled at the meticulous trap Eleanor had set.
She used Arthur's own handwritten journals and offshore bank statements against him.
Those documents became the iron bars of an inescapable legal cage. The contrast between that freezing SUV and the luxury bunker is staggering. It really highlights the grotesque cruelty of his betrayal.
He planned to sip scotch by a warm fire, while his wife froze in the snow.
Eleanor's survival wasn't just some physical victory. It was an absolute psychological conquest. She took the very sanctuary he built with her stolen money and weaponized it. Arthur's meticulously crafted double life was annihilated in minutes. As federal authorities seized his assets, the smug developer was reduced to nothing. He was just a trembling, broken man who finally realized he'd lost everything.
And then there's the younger woman, his secret second wife.
She was left to grapple with the devastating reality of her stolen life.
Her pristine, sheltered existence was completely shattered by a monster's lies.
Standing there on the porch, Eleanor looked out over the wilderness. Those mountains had tried to kill her, but now they stood as a massive testament to her unbreakable spirit. So it leaves us with a chilling question about human endurance. Could you have had the strength to survive the ultimate betrayal? Could you keep your mind intact when the person you trusted most leaves you to die? Imagine being completely cut off from the rest of the world.
No cell service, no heat, and absolutely no rescue coming for you.
With nothing but your sheer, unadulterated willpower to keep you alive. Let me know what you think in the comments below. For 50 years, Eleanor believed the man she married was her protector.
But sometimes, the only protector you have in the wild is yourself.
The trial against Arthur was swift and merciless. That mountain of evidence Eleanor gathered left his lawyers with nowhere to hide. He was hit with attempted murder, massive fraud, and a list of federal charges. The most damning moments in court happened when Arthur's own journals were read out loud. Hearing his arrogant plans to let his wife freeze to death echoed through the room.
His own words locked him away for life.
That multi-million-dollar bunker was quickly seized by the feds. They stripped the heavily fortified sanctuary of its luxury assets and left it sitting in the wild. Now it's just a decaying monument to his ultimate downfall. As for the younger woman, she found herself completely broke overnight. All those offshore accounts that funded her perfect life were frozen.
She had to face the brutal reality that her entire world was paid for by a monster's lies.
Eleanor's physical recovery took months of intense medical care.
The extreme frostbite and starvation left permanent scars on her hands and face.
But she didn't hide them. She wore those marks as badges of her survival.
The mental shift Eleanor went through was even deeper than her physical healing.
That trusting wife who got into the SUV was gone forever.
In her place was a woman who stared into the darkest parts of human cruelty and came out unbreakable. When summer finally hit the Rockies, that lethal frozen landscape turned into a vibrant ecosystem. The deep snow melted away to show lush green valleys. It shows how the wilderness doesn't care. It can be beautiful one minute and merciless the next. Coming back to civilization, Eleanor realized she couldn't relate to everyday problems anymore.
The noise and crowds felt totally alien after months in absolute isolation.
She ended up moving to a quiet farm, finding peace in relying on herself.
Survival experts still look at Eleanor's case as a total anomaly. At 72, with no training and no winter coat, her chances of making it were basically zero. Her story defies logic, proving the will to live can beat impossible odds.
Eleanor's nightmare is a chilling reminder of the darkness that can hide in the people we trust. But more than that, it's proof of the hidden strength inside us.
When life leaves you in the cold, you're the only one who can decide to build a fire.
She had been betrayed by the man she trusted most in the world. Left completely alone in the darkest, coldest corners of the earth, to just fade away.
But the wilderness didn't break her.
Instead of surrendering to the freezing dark, she found a spark of absolute defiance buried deep inside her own chest.
She didn't just survive the impossible odds stacked against her.
She conquered them, turning her husband's perfect crime into the very thing that destroyed him.
It makes you wonder what you're truly capable of when everything is stripped away.
When the comforts of your life vanish in the blink of an eye.
Would you have had the strength to survive that kind of ultimate betrayal?
To wake up completely cut off from the rest of the world?
Imagine being trapped out there in the freezing snow, knowing no one is coming to save you, with nothing but your sheer will to keep you alive. It's a terrifying thought, isn't it? Having to dig that deep just to see another sunrise, relying entirely on your own two hands.
I really want to hear your thoughts on this one.
Let me know in the comments below how you think you'd handle being pushed to the absolute edge.
For 50 years, Eleanor believed the man she married was her ultimate protector. She trusted him with her life, never questioning his intentions.
But her story leaves us with one chilling truth. Sometimes, the only protector you really have out there in the wild is yourself.